going to briefly outline for you the relationship between trade agreements and access to medicines, focusing on three main pathways through which trade agreements can affect the cost of and availability of medicines. Firstly, trade agreements provide monopoly rights for intellectual property holders, including pharmaceutical companies. So this means that patents and other types of intellectual property protection prevent generic manufacturers from making and selling cheaper forms of a drug for a certain period of time. A second pathway is by prescribing rules for pharmaceutical pricing and reimbursement schemes, like Australia's Pharmaceutical Benefits Scheme and New Zealand's PharmAC. These are schemes which are set up to provide affordable access to medicines, contain costs, and ensure value for money for governments. The third main pathway is the investor-state dispute settlement process, which we've talked about a little bit already. And this provides the pharmaceutical industry with an avenue to challenge government policy making around pharmaceuticals. So first, let's have a look at intellectual property protections. The World Trade Organisation's Agreement on Trade-Related Aspects of Intellectual Property Rights, the TRIPS Agreement, set a minimum standard for intellectual property rights in 1995 by mandating 20-year patent terms. And the TRIPS Agreement was widely criticised for putting life-saving medicines out of the reach of millions of people in developing countries. But the TRIPS Agreement does include some safeguards which countries can use to protect public health, such as compulsory licensing and parallel importation. Compulsory licensing is when a government permits a third party to produce a patented drug without the consent of the patent holder. And parallel importation is importing the drug from another country, again without the consent of the patent holder. These are really important mechanisms for enabling access to medicines. And the TRIPS Agreement also includes a fair bit of flexibility for countries to design their own patent laws to suit their own domestic needs. Countries' rights to use these safeguards and flexibilities were reaffirmed in the Doha Declaration of 2001, which Sharon Friel talked about in her presentation this morning, as a big win for public health. And it certainly was. But since the TRIPS Agreement came into force, wealthy countries have applied a lot of pressure to developing countries through a variety of different forums to try and prevent them from using the flexibilities and safeguards that the Doha Declaration allows. One way in which developed countries have applied this pressure is by negotiating free trade agreements outside of the WTO that expand the intellectual property rights that are provided by the WTO TRIPS Agreement. And over the last 2 decades, we've seen a progressive expansion of intellectual property rights in successive bilateral and regional trade agreements, particularly those that are negotiated by the US and the EU, which are home to the big transnational pharmaceutical companies. TRIPS plus intellectual property provisions, which have become standard features of US trade agreements, include patents for new uses and new methods of using existing drugs, so that a company gets not just the 20-year patent on the original product that they produce, but also a number of extra patents for slight modifications or new uses of the same product. This keeps generics out of the market for long periods of time. Companies, these free trade agreements have also included patent term extensions beyond the 20 years, and five extra years is kind of a standard feature of trade agreements now, as well as monopolies on the clinical trial data that's submitted to regulatory agencies such as the Therapeutic Goods Administration in Australia. There are also patent linkage mechanisms that make it more difficult for generic companies to get their drugs approved for sale, as well as restrictions on compulsory licensing and parallel importation. The most egregious example that we've had so far of these TRIPS plus provisions in trade agreements is the initial US proposals for the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, which really sparked a lot of global outrage about what the US was seeking. And these were blunted quite a bit during the negotiations because of the level of outrage around the globe. But even in the final TPP text, when that was released, we still saw a lot of these provisions. So countries were required to have patents for at least one of new uses, new methods or new processes of using existing drugs. They had to provide patent term extensions in some form and data exclusivity over the clinical trial data. And for the first time, the TPP included a set of provisions around biologic drugs, which I don't have time to go into today, but these are the drugs of the future, the very expensive cancer and immunotherapy treatments, which many of them cost hundreds of thousands of dollars per year per patient. And we're looking at sort of extended monopolies on those drugs. And all the countries in the TPP were eventually required to meet the same standards, regardless of their socioeconomic conditions, and only very short transition periods were provided for developing countries. So regardless of all the negative things surrounding Trump's election, many of us breathed a big sigh of relief that the TPP would not actually be coming into force. So as well as intellectual property provisions, many trade agreements, particularly those negotiated by the US, now include rules for pharmaceutical pricing and reimbursement schemes. And these rules are framed in terms of procedural fairness and transparency. So they're supposedly set up to provide more fair conditions for the pharmaceutical companies. But they're clearly designed to actually provide better market access for brand name pharmaceutical companies and to constrain the abilities of countries to control prices through increased disclosure of information around pharmaceutical decision making, allowing the industry to participate more in decision making and providing more leverage for industry in the process of determining which drugs are subsidised, for what conditions and at what price. A third pathway through which trade agreements can affect access to medicines is the investor-state dispute settlement process. So this is becoming a fairly standard part of trade agreements these days. And there have been an explosion of cases in recent years, as Ron showed us. So far there have been few cases of pharmaceutical companies using these provisions, but recently there was a case brought by a US pharmaceutical company called Eli Lilly and Company against the Canadian government for 500 million Canadian dollars after Canadian courts revoked patents on 2 drugs, which were found not to have the promised benefits that the company had claimed when they got the patents on those drugs. Now, Eli Lilly just recently lost the case, but it lost the case on a technicality. It was unable to provide evidence to support certain facts in the case. So it's no consolation to those of us who worry about this avenue and what it provides for pharmaceutical companies in terms of challenging government policies. So I'll leave it there, but plenty to worry about in terms of access to medicines. Thank you.